Hi, everyone. I'll give you a moment to connect to sound. Hello, and welcome to the Broken Rails 1121st New Social Environment. I'm Min, a Programs Associate here at the Rail, and I have the pleasure and privilege of being your MC today for a conversation featuring Joel Sternfeld and Geoffrey Batchen on the occasion of American Prospects at the Bruce Museum. And now I'll introduce today's guest and host. Joel Sternfeld is an artist-photographer whose work is concerned with utopic and dystopic possibilities of the American experience. Since the publication of his landmark study, American Prospects in 1987, his work has maintained conceptual and political aspects while being steeped in history, art history, landscape theory, and attention to seasonal passage. And for our host, a specialist in the history of photography, Geoffrey Batchen is a professor of history of art at University of Oxford. He has a particular interest in the early history of photography, but often brings this into conversation with the present, and especially with contemporary art practices. And with that, I'm going to pass it over to Jeff to get us started.
Thanks so much, Min. And thank you so much, Joel, for agreeing to this conversation. We're all looking forward to hearing you talk about your work and your practice, and especially in relation to American prospects.
Thanks, Jeff. May I also say my thanks to you for hosting or interviewing, and to the Rail. And as you know, my studio is right next to the Rail. I had to do this, or the elevator ride was going to be hell from here on in.
Very good. All right, everybody's thanked everybody. Perhaps mean we could start with the opening slide. There we go. Joel, I thought we might just talk in general for a moment about this particular image as a kind of exemplar of your work before we move on to more detailed discussions about influences and interests and things like that. And one of the things when I was reading your own writing about your work is that you talk about, moving through space, seeing something that looks like it's going to be a picture, and then you say, I make a photograph. And I thought we might start by talking about what I make a photograph means for you. So I assume that at the first instance, it means I make an exposure on a piece of film in the back of a camera. But already certain decisions have been made. And in this case, part of that decision is I decided to shoot with a 8x10 camera on a tripod. Perhaps you could just talk about that decision first up and what it actually means for you as a picture maker.
Well, first, I'll take the easiest part of that. 8x10. Well, Sally Mann has handheld 8x10, but I don't think anybody else has. 8x10, you're dealing with a large wooden device about so big, and with a bellows and a lens that can weigh 3 or 4 pounds. And it's nothing that you could handhold it, but you wouldn't get a very sharp image. So there must be a tripod involved. And this picture and all of the work of American Prospects came about because in the spring of 1978, I received a Guggenheim Fellowship. And it had been awarded for a body of street work that I had done 2 years previous. And the street work came out of a period of sadness and illness and a sort of a feeling about the United States. There was a sharp economic recession in 1976. So it's a rather urgent and somewhat gloomy body of work. But with the Guggenheim in hand and being healthier, I decided to do what I have always wanted to do, and that is travel the United States, and in particular, follow the seasons around the United States. As a child, I read the books of Edwin Way Teale, and Teale was a nature writer who would do something like start in Florida in late January. And with his wife, they would proceed north at the rate of 15 miles a day, stopping off at places where the season was particularly manifest. And they'd arrive in Maine, northern Maine, sometime in June, late June. And then they'd write about it and write about what they saw in each place along the way. And that book, along with many other, I read the nature writers avidly. I read Thoreau, I read John Burroughs, particularly read Henry Beston, who spent a year in a little shack at the end of Cape Cod and followed a cycle of the year. This idea of following a cycle of the year was with me, is what I'm trying to say. So I decided I was going to travel with the season, start in New England, come south through the Appalachians, come across the southern tier of the United States, and follow the spring north on the West Coast. And it was a kind of crazy decision. It was one of those things you think you can do when you're young, is cover the whole country in a beat up Volkswagen with bald tires and $40 in your pocket. But that's what I was doing.
And Joel, how do you know when to stop that Volkswagen and get out all the gear?
Well, let me take it a little bit further to situate you in this picture, and then you'll see where I'm going. In following the seasons, if this is going to be your once in a lifetime opportunity to follow your dream, you don't want to describe it with a little 35 millimeter camera. You want to describe it with the best possible means available. And that's 8x10. In the world of photography, this is the sine qua non of cameras and methodologies. And so I decided to work 8x10, but in order to work 8x10, I could afford 2 negatives a day that entire first year. So if you've got 2 negatives a day, you've got to know quite clearly in advance what it is you're interested in broad terms, in broad measure. And so I storyboarded the year, if you will. It wasn't storyboarding in a pictorial sense. It was storyboarding in terms of what I wanted to say, what my felt sense of urgency about the United States at that moment was. So on the morning that I woke up in Austin, Texas, and heard on the radio, which was my principal form of communication with the outside world, that the space shuttle had taken off from Arizona and was going to land at Kelly Lackland Air Force Base outside of San Antonio, I took off. It was 6 o'clock in the morning, and I made it there by 9 o'clock in the morning. And I knew that this was interesting because, in broad terms, my thesis had to do with the older America of the Northeast, what Calvin Trilling has called the ancien region of the United States, and the new America, high-tech, California, the other America that was being born. And so this seemed like it might be an interesting situation. There was no parking, or there was parking about a half a mile or more from the gates of the Air Force Base. And if you'll indulge me, I'll tell you a story. Tell me if you want me to cut it short, but I think it's a revelatory story about what it was like to travel in America in those days. Permission granted?
Yeah, we're all ears.
Okay. So I start walking down the road with about 30 pounds of equipment on my back in a backpack and carrying a big heavy tripod. And I got to the gate and realized that I'd forgotten the one credential I had, a letter from the Guggenheim Foundation, written in very highfalutin, formal language, arcane language. And it said, this recommended me to the good offices of all those I encountered. And there's a private at the gate. And I said, look, I forgot my Guggenheim letter, but I've got to get up on the roof of that building over there, because there are technical reasons why with an 8x10, you need to be high. And also, I knew about the God's eye viewpoint from Patinier onward in the landscape tradition. And the private took me to a sergeant, and the sergeant took me to a lieutenant, and the lieutenant took me to a colonel. And finally, they got to the general, and I had nothing. And I had long hair, and, you know, I'm a bit bedraggled because I slept in the van at almost 29 nights out of 30. And I got to the general, and I made my plea, and he said to this private who was still with me, take this guy up to the roof of that building. And that's how I got up there and made this picture.
Right. It wouldn't happen today, Joel, like that. So I'm interested then in what happens when you use a camera like this. For a start, everything in the book and almost everything in your work, I think, is horizontal, a horizontal rectangle. And I'm wondering if even without the camera, you see the world in horizontal rectangles now, like always is in terms of potential pictures.
No, I don't. I think in Stranger Passing, there are, which is a companion body of work to American Prospects, there are verticals, and I have no particular commitment to the horizontal, except I have perceived myself to be a landscapist. And historically, if you're a landscapist, you're horizontal.
Yeah, yeah. So you only had a couple of sheets of negative film per day. Does that mean you only made the single exposure for this work?
For this particular setup, or for the work in general?
Well, for this one exposure was enough.
I don't know. I probably made one or two others. You know, initially that sounds like a formula: one negative in the morning and one negative in the evening, something like that. But the number of things that can go wrong with 8x10, both in the making of the photograph and in the processing of the film, are 10 times more than with 35 millimeter. And so eventually you develop a hierarchy of what's interesting, what's important. That's where your storyboarding or your sense of what you want to say comes in. I knew this was an important situation, and I knew this was a technically extremely difficult picture to make. And I probably chanced several negatives, because to hold depth of field from 5 feet away to 100 or 200 yards away is hard. But to have moving people and stop them, I can't go into the reasons, but 8x10 is not known as a camera of action. And one of the things I yet am proud of with American Prospects is this technique of getting up high, starting the picture 20, 30, 40 feet away, and being able to stop action. And I think that's become common coin now, but the time that I was doing it, it was not.
I mean, if you could just take us back to that first slide when you get a chance. I mean,
I'm not.
There we go. The other striking element, of course, is that the photograph happens to be in color. So once you've got a negative, Joel, could you talk to us through the creative process that occurs between the negative and the print that we finally see? How much intervention do you make as an artist at that point? What kind of decisions
I'm
do
not
you have
sure
to
what
make?
you're asking. I printed it. Are you asking if it's modified in any way?
Well, I'm sure that at that stage you're making various decisions about color, for example. You do have some creative control, however, how that color is going to appear in the final print. And there's then also the question of size. I mean, these are issues that we tend to take for granted, but I'm just interested in your actual decision-making process as you're working from a negative.
Well, I was working with the negative, and I could go into this at length, but it might, if you'll hold off on the chromatic question until we go into the other slides, I
Okay.
think that may serve to explicate the color. There were decisions about the type of film, the lens, and the printing methodology, but you'd have to know my grand thesis about color to understand that.
Okay.
With regard to size,
Yeah.
size has always been a difficult issue because with 8 by 10, there are details that are absolutely wonderful to behold, but unless you blow things up to a really large size, you can't see them too well. But then if you make a big print, and I'm going to do something and you tell me if this works. Can you guys see this?
Yeah, we can sort of see it.
Yeah.
Yeah. But we get a
You know,
sense, yeah, it's quite a large
you know,
print on the wall.
yeah, you want to make a big print, although at the time that I was first exhibiting this work, big prints were a rarity, if anything. There was a show at the Museum of Modern Art called Big Pictures, and while I was on what I had a second Guggenheim, and I didn't even bother to see it. I was in New York, but I was so anxious to get out on the road again that I didn't take notice of it. But you want to make big prints, but then again, big prints are not the sort of thing that every time you take one across town, you need a truck and 4 people. So there's a trade-off between what the 8 by 10 negative will facilitate and what's pragmatic in terms of having the work viewed. But I would say that I can make these even bigger. I can make these. I have one in my home that's 7 feet by 9 feet, and it's glorious.
And so in your mind, that's the ideal size if you could manage it?
I don't know. It quite depends on the image and
Yeah, I was going to say.
the other intentionality of the body of work. American Prospects is one body of work in which maybe a large size might be ideal. The highest moment for me in art is unity of form and content. In this instance of America being the content, perhaps a large size would be ideal because I think we tend to think of America as a large country in sweeping terms. That's part of our mythology of America. So grand prints might be provide a unity of form and content for a different body of work. And I have many actually, in which a small print provides the unity. So I don't think the question can be answered in general. It relates to each body of work and its intentionality.
Yeah. I mean, one thing that you mentioned about adopting the 8 by 10 as your camera of choice, at least for this project, is, handheld cameras always seem to have a relationship to the body of the photographer and perhaps also then to the body of the viewer. But a 8 by 10, there's a sense in which you always feel like you're floating in space somehow, slightly off I mean, you are off the ground, but in the sense of the way the picture positions you in front of it. And I wonder if that directs the way you frame your picture, compose your picture, especially in this case where we have a surrogate for ourselves in the foreground looking out over the same scene.
Well, I think I did have ideal framing but I don't think it had anything to do with the camera per se. I think that, after some period of time, you become quite fluid with the 8x10. Now, if I have a situation, because I know my lens and I know my point of view in a body of work, with the 8x10, I can set up in a minute. That includes walking to the ideal spot and setting up the camera soup to nuts. So it becomes really a part of you, and it doesn't take very long to set it up and make a picture. But there is one aspect of 8x10 that, or this body of work with 8x10 that your question might pertain to, and that is with 8x10, there's perhaps a greater need to fill the frame vertically. And I'm giving away my technique, but in many of the pictures in American Prospects, you will find a strong vertical 1/3 of the way in on either side of the frame. And it's not so much out of any belief in any system of organization. I was aware more so of the golden spot within a frame, this painting idea. And some of the pictures have that employed, a great many of them actually, not because I believe in it, but because it's a natural organization of the frame.
Right. Sorry, Min, if we could just go back to slide 1 again. So one of the other things that strikes me, Joel, when I was looking at this photograph and indeed through the book in general, if you like, another effect of the choice of color, especially in this period in the late 70s, when it's still a relatively new aspect, at least of the art photography scene, is that on the one hand, the photograph encourages us to look through it, if you like, at the subject matter, a space, vehicle, people in the middle ground, a figure in the foreground. But then you come back to the surface of the print and you start to notice the way you have organized things. For example, the 3 bands of horizontal form that organizes this particular photograph. And then with that vertical of that man that subtends the 3 of them. The way in which the foreground is sort of nothingness, and then the middle ground is crowded with ant-like figures, and then we have a sky that goes back to a kind of blankness. In other words, there's a strange kind of push-pull of the photograph itself, where it asks me to look through it, into it, if you like, and then back to the surface and notice the various formal elements of it. And I'm just wondering, as you're taking photographs, are you thinking like that, or this is just a happenstance of the way you work?
Well, there are 2 answers to that, but they don't go in the direction you're going. There's no formalist interest per se, none. I leave that to the academics later on. What there is, and this is essential, I think, is the problem of the photograph in color altogether. And that is that you and I have never seen the world in color, in black and white. We only see it in color. Therefore, when we look at a black and white photograph, there's an immediate level of abstraction. Whereas the color photograph, we can compare to our experience right, left, up, and down. And so for the color photograph to be transporting, there needs to be built into the color photograph some level of abstraction. And that's a very complicated matter. It can occur in many, many different ways. In this photograph, and in actually every photograph in American Prospects, there is a formal means to that, which I follow pretty rigorously, and that is, I went through Albers' color theory in the landscape. I made photographs that happened to coincide with Albers' exercises. in the years before American Prospects. And then by happenstance, I made a photograph that gave me a reason. And if we go to the next slides, I can show it to you. But let's just wait 1 minute. Let me finish my sentence, please. Let's go back to this because I'll say something else about it. And maybe, Min, if I had control of the slides, we could go a little smoother. Is that possible at this juncture? All right, let it stay. We're going to run out of time. So
let me know what you would like to move to, and I can move the slides for you.
Yeah, just stay with it, Min, and let me just finish this thought.
Okay.
To abstract the color photograph was my intention, to provide you. So if you're seeing these three broad planes of horizons or subtle color shifts, the plane of the roof, the plane of the cement ground, the plane of the sky, those are all, in my mind, working to provide this abstraction, to take this out of our everyday perception of color and into some higher realm. Or if you want to put it in other terms, Walker Evans said that he wanted photographs to be literate, authoritative, and transcendent. Now, literate, we can guess at what he meant. Authoritative, we can also guess at what he meant, something that was so organized in a way that we felt the photographer was in control. But it's the transcendence that becomes very complex and needs to be achieved in every color photograph. And so I came up with this little euphemism, aphorism about transcendence. Transcendence begins, in fact, rises above it, returns to it. And it happens in different ways, in different images, and in different literary works. And in transcendence occurs, in many ways, in many forms. In this photograph, maybe what happens here is we see the space shuttle, and we see, this strange sight of the space shuttle piggybacked on a 747. And we see this figure looking at it, and, the mind goes to, oh, who is going to go up in that? Will this man clearly not be an astronaut, but who will? And you journey in the mind into space flight and space travel. And then we come back. So that's the rising above daily reality, the speculation about these two things that we see primarily in the picture. And then we come back to, he's balding. He's got a pot belly. Life, he's aging. We're all aging. And we're back in the diurnal again. So I've never really analyzed this picture in those terms, but I think if you go through American Prospects, you're going to see that, number one, there's some attempt through the color to achieve a level of abstraction, and there's some attempt to achieve some moment of transcendence that then returns to daily life.
Okay, right. Maybe we could move forward in the slides, Min, because Joel's just hold there for a minute. Joel was just speaking about the figure that happens to be in the foreground of the photograph we were just looking at. And he was telling us earlier about his mother's ceramic work. And I think you wanted to make a correspondence here, Joel.
Well, just a little bit, only in the sense that my mother died 20 years ago, but and she lived to be 96. But in the last years of her life, she did terracotta. She also worked in marble, and both my parents were artists, although my dad gave it up to provide a living for his sons. But my mother had a particularized sense of humor in her work, and I I can only speculate about it, and we can just move right on. But this figure, I was going through the slides for the lecture or for the interview, occurred to me that it's almost the same figure as that fellow who's up on the roof. And I just thought I'd toss it in and use this as an opportunity to give a nod to my mother.
Very good. Very good. Maybe we could move on to the next photograph slide in of the vehicle.
Yeah,
because I think what we were talking in part about what color does to a photograph and what the choice of shooting in color does for a photographer. And so I think in this case, we're moving backwards a little bit in time, where you're still using handheld camera, but you've decided you're going to shoot in color. Maybe you could just talk us through that a little bit, Joel.
Well, from the very first roll of film that I ever made, I knew I had a question. I knew that I was a landscapist or someone just vitally interested in nature and in particular, the changing of the seasons. I could go on and on about it, but I grew peas behind the garage at age 3. I was a bird watcher. I wanted to be a farmer. I knew that I was a landscapist at heart. So when I turned to photography, the question was, could I express seasonality and could I express landscape in black and white, but in particular seasonality? And in a surprisingly organized move, I went out with a tripod and 2 cameras and made the same scene in black and white and in color in several instances. And I made the decision that I needed the color. I don't know I would say that's a right decision now. There are photographers, particularly Robert Adams, who make pictures that give me such a seasonal feeling. There's no Robert Adams picture that I don't have a visceral response to, but I made the decision to be a color photographer or to work in color. But there was no one ahead of me. I didn't get to meet Eggleston until 1974. I didn't go into the back room of Light Gallery and see these 12 8x10 contacts by Stephen Shore that just staggered me until 1974. I was working on my own. And I was wrestling with what is the highest and best use of the photograph in color. And I came up with this little formulation for myself that went something like, in the good or successful color photograph, the definition of the picture or the meaning of the picture will somehow arise through the use of color. So when I was driving down a street in Washington, D.C. in August 1974, and I saw this couple going the other way, and I saw that she had bothered to get sunglasses that just about matched their 1957 turquoise Thunderbird. I made an immediate U-turn and pulled up at a red light next to them and made this picture. You can see I'm quite eye level with them. But for me, this is a successful color photograph in that the meaning of the picture, their relationship to each other, their relationship to the car, is somehow punctumized, if you will, by the color of her sunglasses.
Yeah. How about the next one, man?
And so in those years, we're still before American Prospects. I was looking for other answers to the photograph in color. And all the painters that I knew were working out of Albers' color theory. I mean, there's lots of other color theory. There's Itten, there's Kandinsky. Everybody at the Bauhaus had a different color theory. Goethe had a color theory. Steiner had a color theory. You know, there's nothing about Albers that's absolute. But anytime I saw an Albers exercise naturally occurring in the landscape, I made a picture. The question is, to what avail? If we go to the next slide, let me see if that tells us anything. Well, the avail might be, I never would have made a picture like this, except I was interested in how that green interacts with the red of the wall, how it interacts with the brownishness of this tree. So in that sense, Albers helped me to see color where I might not see it otherwise, to see how colors were operating. But it didn't lead to any generalized notion. It was very interesting to do, but not at all an answer in and of itself.
But it's interesting, isn't it? Because when you're thinking like this, that is, you've got a certain kind of understanding of color. You're trying to, if you like, bend photography to the will of that color theory. It asks, so what is this photograph about? If somebody comes and looks at this photograph, and indeed you are required then to be beginning to think, well, it doesn't seem to be of anything of great significance except for these relationships that you've set up in the frame of the camera.
Not true. Because look, there are these formal relationships, these chromatic relationships, but it's also about winter and summer. The trees are bare. A tennis court we associate with summer. So, it does have its own seasonal moment to it. And it maybe says something about the contemporary world because the tennis court is an artificial surface. And it has something to do with exclusion. Outside the fence, there's debris, and within the tennis court it's all clean, and maybe that's the tennis whites compared to the rest of us plebeians who aren't playing tennis. So there is a content here. My interest is never purely formal.
Okay. Can we try the next slide, please, Mick?
So this is just for people who are unfamiliar, an Albers exercise, and we don't need to go into it in any sort of way. But then you see what happens in the summer of 1975. I go down to Nags Head, North Carolina. I was facing some surgery that could have left me paralyzed. I had to go back to New York. It's a family problem. But I had, in January of 1976, I had the surgery. And in the period of recovery, I wanted to work, but I couldn't move very quickly at all. So I began to use Flash in the daytime. It gave me a sense of being able to stop the action, if you will. I wasn't fluid in my body movements. And again, I'm doing these Albers exercises, without knowing why. Next slide, please.
I just ask, I think you told me previously you're actually shooting on slide film for these pictures.
That's correct.
Yeah. So there's obviously a complicated process from getting from slide film to print, and the various adjustments you have to make to retain the color that you want.
You make an internegative, which is, in this case, I take a 35 millimeter slide and expose it onto a piece of negative film, and then you print from that negative. And there's no particular artistry involved. It's just something you do. It's not revelatory, I don't think. Okay. Can we go on?
Yeah.
So this is just the same exercise, although I will say that I was also aware at the time that H.L. Mencken had a notion that every age has its own characteristic color scheme. Maybe we think of the Civil War and that era, Lincoln as stovepipe black. Mencken had this odd theory about the period from when Lincoln was shot until the great Chicago Exposition of 1894. he called that the brown period. I don't know if that's true, but certainly the 60s and the 70s were a day glow period. And so when I saw this couple coming down Madison Avenue, I wasn't interested in who they were or what they represented, but I wanted that day glow because I thought that was representative of the time. We could go to the next one. And just another one, these street pictures this gives you a sense of the kind of urgency or anxiety of the street work. The Watergate era was still fresh in memory. The Vietnam War was still fresh in memory. There was an economic recession, and a lot of these pictures are fairly angsty.
Yeah,
you can go to the next one.
You have spoken about a kind of malaise.
Well, that's it's ascribed to Jimmy Carter. It comes a little later, but Jimmy Carter had a period of 10 days in the spring of 1980, I guess, or 79, when he went off to Camp David to think about things, and he had a secret meeting with a steel worker in Pittsburgh to get the viewpoints of a real American. And then he came back and he made a speech about the moral crisis in America, and that became known as the malaise speech. And that's why Reagan said it was morning in America, and Jimmy Carter said there's something wrong with us, we're immoral. And what's interesting, and the reason I'm going into that story, is I think that to the extent that American Prospects has relevance now, it may be because from that moment of Reagan being elected, there's been a more or less unbroken line of cultural and social change, conservatism, politically and socially, societally. And, I didn't know that when I did American Prospects, that this would continue, but I saw that happening in that period. And unfortunately, it has continued. But, it was something I was really attuned to. This
is quite a crucial picture, I think, for you.
Well, I came back to New York in the summer of 1975 because there was a death in the family. And I never went back to Nag's Head. And I've just published that body of work within the last year. And one day I went to the beach and I went in this direction. And I'm phobic about large buildings by the sea. And I thought this scene was as ugly as it gets. It was really hell to me. And it's that type of August day when the summer's over. It's not even the dog days, it's worse. But I looked up, and I it's mawkish to tell, but I was crying, and I looked up, and I wasn't crying over the scene, I was crying over family matters. And I looked up, and all of a sudden, there's a Japanese notion, which I can't find and prove, of something called tashata, clear seeing in a clear light, or something like that. The doors of perception open. And the doors of perception opened for me for a moment, and I took a picture thinking there was something there. And then I more or less put it away. But when I received that Guggenheim in 1978, I was absolutely galvanized. Here I had the opportunity of a lifetime. I had a sabbatical from teaching. What was I going to do? And I went through all of my old pictures and I asked myself, which one was the best? And oddly enough, this one came up. And I think I started to analyze it. What was it about this picture that made it the best? And bit by bit, I began to think, if you'll go to the next slide, of Paul Klee. And this is one of the watercolors he made in Tunisia in maybe about 1919 with Auguste Mack. He went there with the painter Auguste Mack. But Klee, who was at the Bauhaus, organized many of his pictures with 2 or 3 dominant hues of equal density or relatively equal density. And I started to think about that as an aesthetic for this entire body of work that would come. And it was a combination of simply finding it transporting, and when you know that now you know that I'm trying to make something transcendent. And so I started to think of this color combination as transporting, but I also thought of Mencken, and I thought that this was appropriate to the America I was about to describe, in the sense that, Mediterranean decoration of an interior, Starbucks or the equivalent or fast food was starting to appear in the countryside. Mass chains of motels were appearing. High tech was appearing in California. There was a new sort of pseudo sophistication, a slight Europeanization of the American experience, if you will. And this seemed like a palette that might provide unity of form and content. If you go to the next slide, you can see that I'm working with that. This is somewhat the same palette as the Paul Klee in the broadest sense. And so that became this formal device. You asked, when would I get out the camera? On a sunny day with contrasty light? Never. But when I had light that facilitated this, you see, that's another aspect of this, and that's what complicates it, is you can't achieve this chromatic equality unless you've got light that facilitates it. And so this was a condition where I had it. And as I traveled and followed the seasons and tried to say what I wanted to say about America, I also had to wait for the light. And that really guided me. If it's a bright sunny day and, the contrast between the shadows and the highlights is too great, I know that I'm not going to need the tripod and the camera.
And Joel, why did you need figures in this particular composition? I mean, you've been talking about yourself as a landscape photographer, and you're showing us the Klee, and yet here we have these two
why
figures.
did I need them? Because I was interested in them. I walked down this cul-de-sac, I came, and there was almost no one out. That's one of the other aspects of it. Was at the 3rd year of travel on American Prospects, and I was starting to turn my attention to the American people. I knew that something, I didn't know what its name would be, but I knew that Stranger Passing was coming as a companion body of work. American Prospects being the landscape, Stranger Passing being the American people. So I was feeling that tendency to begin describing the American people. And they were almost the only people out, and the light was good. And so here's the whole calculus. Here's the whole matrix. Yeah. The light was good. The situation was good. The new America, which was something I was very much interested in expressing. And they looked like new America in a way, their outfits. And so I asked to photograph them. As it turns out, I always try to send my pictures to the people that I've photographed. I tried to send a picture to them, but they had moved. But the young woman in this picture saw this photograph up at the LA County, and she got in touch with me. And I sent a print to them, and I sent a copy of American Prospects to them, and we became friends. She took a job at the Milwaukee Art Museum because she became interested in photography, and we still trade Christmas cards, and actually we're friends on Instagram now. She's a woman with 3 children, and it's some let's see, this is about 1982, 18, and about 42 years later, so she's about 50 years old, and she would like it if I would come out and photograph her and her family, and I would like it. It just hasn't happened, but it was because they seemed like representative people to the extent that anybody is representative of the United States.
That's a very nice story. I mean, one of the things that struck me when I was looking closely at this picture is the way he looks directly into the camera and therefore directly at us. But she's looking off over your shoulder to some distant horizon. And there's something about that too, that the youth in the picture is looking sort of beyond the present, and the guy is looking so directly at us. And I wonder if that played into your New America ethos as well. But I guess maybe it's just one of those happy accidents that occurs at the moment of exposure.
It was one of those happy accidents of instinct. What happened was he was a bit of a foreboding figure. He was a chiropractor who played the California real estate market and eventually wound up in some difficulties. I won't go into it. But I didn't know all that, of course, at the time. But he was, not warm and fuzzy, at least initially. One never knows. Maybe if I had spent time, he would have been as warm and fuzzy as anyone. But in the moment, he was not. And no blame to him either. When somebody shows up at your house with an 8x10 view camera, you're not supposed to be warm and fuzzy. But in any case, I set up the 8x10, and I did something I never quite done. I turned to the lens. I wasn't facing them. The lens is over here. I'm in front of the camera, and I could see them in the lens. Mm-hmm. And at a certain moment, it felt like a portrait moment. And I simply said, hold that. And I made 2 negatives. They're both identical. Because by now I had a hierarchy of what I thought was interesting or what might work out as a photograph. And I made 2 negatives because the odds of light leaks or the lab messing up the processing are very high with 8x10. Yeah. Fortunately, both negatives came out, and there's barely a muscle twitch between them.
Perfect subjects. Why don't we keep moving forward? We're almost run out of time. This, of course, is one of your best-known pictures. And, I mean, I presume you knew there was a landslip and you found a way to get your camera in the right place to capture it in all of its drama. But it also seems to be an allegory of exactly this malaise or this, I don't know, this struggle between nature and the American dream that it so often seems to come up in the project.
Precisely. I was in Los Angeles. I heard that there had been flash flooding in Rancho Mirage, which is some 120 miles east. Lily, can you get them? Sorry, you get X left and Zeus. My dog is mad because my collections manager left and they're very attached. So he's barking to tell him to come back into the space. So I drove out to Rancho Mirage. And again, it's a story that illustrates what it was like to travel in America in those days. It's 118 degrees in Rancho Mirage when I arrived. The Volkswagen has absolutely no air conditioning. And I've got film that is sensitive to heat. And all the power is out. And so I went into the local firehouse, which had emergency generator, and they had air conditioning. And I asked the firemen if I could store my film for the day at the firehouse, and they were quite willing. And in fact, they Xeroxed maps of the area to show me where the good disaster or the good damage was. And I came back late that night, and they asked me if I had seen the TransAm down the ravine. And I actually didn't know what a TransAm was, but I said no. And so they said, "Oh, you've got to see this." And they put me on the fire truck, like a little kid up top where and they drove out to this scene at night with the lights flashing, and they shone a searchlight on the scene. And the truth of the matter is, I still didn't know what was so wonderful about it. But I thought, if they're excited, I better be excited. And so I spent the next 3 hours in a payphone trying to get permission from the head of the Salvation Army, which somehow had control over the disaster zone. Finally, at about midnight, 1 o'clock in the morning, I got permission. I slept in the van in a parking lot of a supermarket for about 4 hours. And then I got up at about 4:30, 5 o'clock in the morning. And that also relates to your previous questions about what dictates when you get out the tripod, when you get out the film. If you look carefully, you can see at the top of the mountains, the sun is just coming over the mountains. Mm-hmm. And I knew that I needed to be there before that to get this kind of equal density in the lighting and in the color of the scene. You notice that the whole thing yet coincides with this chromatic theory about 2 or 3 hues of equal density. And so I made the picture. And, honestly, I didn't know why they were so excited, but it fit within this broader sense that I had. By the early 1980s, late 1970s, there was a sense, a very small sense, but James Hansen had spoken to Congress, to Al Gore's hearing. It wasn't the big hearing, which occurred in 1988, when he really announced climate change. But there was altogether in America, there was a sense of something amiss. And in fact, even in the popular press or the leftist press, there were stories about a sense of apocalypse. And so this coincided with that. And that's why I went to Rancho Mirage. It's not necessarily why I made the picture of the TransAm, but maybe you don't have to be good, you have to be lucky.
Yeah.
Or it sort of reminds me of a story about how Harry Callahan, the photographer, he made pictures of Eleanor, his wife, nudes in the landscape. And there's a picture of her in a certain place with bushes and trees in the background, and it's a nude. And someone at the lecture once asked Harry Callahan, "Mr. Callahan, did you make that picture of your wife because there was this relationship between the feminine forms in the bushes and the trees and her form?" And Callahan said, "No, to tell you the truth, there was a parking place." So
there you go. Why don't we I think the next one might be another one of your canonical images. Oh, no.
Yeah. Yes and no. Yeah, it follows this idea of 2 or 3 dominant hues. But if I don't know if I've got it here, but if American Prospects is organized in terms of some sort of mythic journey throughout the United States, seasonal, regional. It's hard to articulate it quickly, but there's also this utopic, dystopic notion of. I've been interested in utopic schemes ever since I was 10, 11, 12 years old. I knew about Brook Farm. I knew about the Transcendentalists. I was the only kid who was relieved to find out that there was this word transcendentalism and a name for the feelings I was having. And so this is a gold El Dorado, which is, one of the reasons people searched out the New World is this the El Dorado of gold. Let's see what the next slide is, and maybe I can show you well, it isn't here, but the entire opening sequence of American Prospects organizes around this. And so there, I here, I know you're a scholar of, well, not so much Baudrillard, but Derrida and Foucault, but Baudrillard talks about the simulacra. And I didn't pay attention to critical theory in those years closely, but Barth's mythologies was important to me, and that's where this sort of mythical journey and this deconstruction of the previous landscape tradition, American Prospects is kind of a peeling away of Norman Rockwell and Saturday Evening Post landscape depiction. And here's, a simulacra of the sea, artificial nature, if you will. And that's, so, I went to Orlando thinking I would photograph Disney World, Land, whatever it's called. But at first I went to this place, and it was precisely because of wanting a simulacra that I made the picture. So, that's what I mean by a storyboarded experience.
Yeah. No, it's perfect. You've mentioned the book a couple of times, so we'll just show it to our audience. This is the sixth printing, came out in 2023. Could you just quickly, Joel, say something about the book as a book? Obviously, you've made these shots. You've got to think about sequencing. You've got to think about design. And now you've had to think about that 6 times because you've done it 6 different times. And I understand that each one is slightly different than the last. So maybe you could speak to that as well.
I can. Well, Walt Whitman made 9 different editions of Leaves of Grass, each one different, including the so-called deathbed edition, which I hope I don't get to the 9th edition of the American Prospects. One of the reasons why there are these 6 different editions, or why this edition exists, is simply because the book is always out of print and it gets very high priced. And Gerhard Steidl and I wanted to make one that would have a very low price tag and be available to students, to everyone. And so that's what the one that you have in your hands is. It has a price of $45 in the United States, and it's all sold out. And I'm pretty sure that Gerhard will not reprint it because he's bored with reprinting. Even though he knows he could sell many, many more books. I'll be surprised if it happens. I'll push him to do so, but it will not likely happen. There's another edition. I'm sorry.
Sorry. I was just going to say, but in each edition, you add a different image or a new image, and like Whitman, you kind of return to the poem and rethink it.
Well, it happens for a variety of reasons. The most important reason it changes is because my ideas about photography have changed, and there in the initial edition of American Prospects, I was creating this almost postmodern mythic vision of America. It's hard to describe the particulars of it quickly, but it has an element of fantasy about it. And as the years have gone on, and as my perception of things has changed, I've wanted to include more pictures that really spoke more directly to poverty and racism and any number of other difficulties in American life. I'm not sure that I've improved the book, but I've improved my sense of what I'm doing. And in particular, there's a version coming sometime next year. It's all proofed and ready, but it has to be printed. That has 30, maybe 20, 30 new images, because during the COVID years, I spent those years in my studio going through negatives. In 1978 and 79, I didn't have the money to contact print everything. So I would eyeball a negative. And eyeballing a negative is not really an ideal way to determine its content. For example, if you'll hold up the book again, I'll show you something. This was made in the very first month that I was traveling. And I took a look at the negative and I thought, oh, there's not much going on there. And then when I finally got around to printing it, I had forgotten that it was a frosty morning. I'm not sure if it shows on the screen, but it you know, or if I make my screen large, yeah, it's a frosty morning, and there's just this delicate hue of the grass, and it just happens to be of equal density with the little yellow Volkswagen, and it's a rather nice picture. And if you know New England, it's a real September type picture. There are sharp and misty mornings. But in 1979, when I looked at the negative, I had forgotten all that, and I thought it's really not an important picture. I quite like it now, and so there's been this kind of you're looking like Vanna White. You can take it down.
Thanks very much. She was a very well-preserved woman.
If you don't want to be Vanna White, take it down. So that's essentially what's happened. Is I've discovered maybe 20, 30, 40 pictures that I think are pretty good. And some of them are in that non plus ultra edition, which is coming.
Right. Now, Joel, I suspect we have some questions from our audience. Min, do you have some questions to relay to us?
Thank you, Joel and Geoffrey. That was so wonderful. We're gonna ask some questions from the audience and conclude our NSE with Joel's poetry reading. There's a form in the chat where you can submit your questions, and we encourage you to submit questions for Joel and Jeff. The first question is from G, and I'm going to read. How much of your work arrives by visual intuition? And if so, have you always worked by this visual intuition? Or if not, how did you develop it? Thank you.
I would say 14%. No, I'm teasing. I can't quantify it, but very well. In the first measure, very little is intuitive. Because of the 8x10, you have to know what it is you're interested in saying, or you don't. But I don't posit this as a universal working method, but it's my working method. Otherwise, what are you going to do? You've got 2 negatives a day. Now I've got a little more, but you've got very limited amount of times you can press the shutter. You've got to have a hierarchy of interest, a hierarchy of what it is you're intending to say. And so initially, there is a kind of broad sense of things that might fit. I didn't know that I would come across a house on fire with pumpkins in front of it, and that then a fireman would step out and pick his pumpkin. but I knew that I wanted to say that something was amiss in America. So my broad sense of what I wanted to say made me stay at that scene for 4 or 5 hours until something happened. The intuition comes in at the right moment when the fireman comes out. But most of it is ideational. I have an idea.
Thank
Great.
you, Joel. We have another question from the audience from Ellen. Having gone across country with you on this site, I remember the importance of light, the flatness of it based on the time of day. You talked a lot about color and then the sun just coming over the mountain and needing to get the shot before the sun. Could you speak about light?
Oh boy. Well, there is a flatness of light that's helpful to what I'm doing with this theory of 2 or 3 colors of equal density. But if you just had that sort of light, this flat light, I don't think the pictures would be quite as interesting, because here and there's some other element, a grace note of a bolt of sunlight, a cloud pattern, something else that animates the frame and makes it breathe and become alive. You know, the Beschers and some of the other people in the Dusseldorf school worked with, I don't know if this is the Beschers term, objective skies. What did they mean by objective skies? No cloud patterns, this flat Middle European light. And maybe it rather works if you're doing a Becher typology, photographing coal tipples and wanting people to compare 10 of them or 20 of them. But purely flat light doesn't do it for me. But what that hand of God lighting might be in each instance is quite different. And also, if you really want the advanced notion of things, particular things look good in particular light. I don't know that I can provide a formula for that, but if you use your eyes, what I always say is that something is always looking good in the light, but you've got to really see what that is, and it's different every time. And so it's a combination of light and what's taking that light. It's complicated.
Thank you, Joel. Our next question is from Charlie, our managing editor.
Uh-oh.
Thanks, Joel. Thanks, Jeff, so much. Really have enjoyed this conversation immensely. Joel, I wanted to ask kind of a simple and a broad one at the same time. I know that you're a beloved professor. I wonder how you became a professor, how you came to the idea of teaching as something important to you, and if there was a teacher you had who was particularly formative when you were getting started.
Well, the second part of your question is easier than the first. I consider Helen Levitt to be my teacher. It was an informal relationship, but back in roughly 1974, I presented my work to a gallery, Carlton Gallery, Carlton Willers. He showed Cartier-Bresson, and there were almost no galleries who showed photography, so we were in that period. And he showed Helen Levitt. And Carlton took a few pieces. Nothing happened with them. I still have them here in frames. But I was then able to call up Helen Levitt and say, you show at Carlton, I show at Carlton, can we talk? And in those days, it was sort of like the early Christians. Color was a subversive faith. And if you met another color photographer, you wanted to get together in a cave and talk about it. You use Kodachrome, you use Ektachrome, they, well, what lab do you use to process the film? It was really that kind of thing. And there was a certain kind of wonderful camaraderie, if you will, or just, a sharing that was based on our relative small number of participants. I went up to Cambridge, and William Eggleston in the fall of 74 or 5 spent a good 2 or 3 hours going through shoebox after shoebox of prints, drugstore prints, and talking about them. And it was enormously helpful, and he was so gracious and so kind, and helpful not in the way that it pointed me towards something, but pointed me away, because I could see that he owned the poetic snapshot, and that if I was ever going to move ahead, I couldn't just be doing that, because I was working in not unrelated ways. And so I remember driving back to New York and thinking that I had to change. And that's what pushed me to narrativity within the photograph and within the body of work. And I think it's a way I always wanted to go, but seeing that Eggleston had gone the way he had let me know there was no room. Teaching was just something I applied for and was lucky enough to get. And the real motive was because when you teach, you work for 8 or 9 months, and then you've got maybe 3 or 4 months off, and it's compatible with doing your art. So it's astounding to me how little I made in that Guggenheim year, when I had already been teaching for 7 years at the college or university level. I saw my application. I think I made $11,000 a year from teaching, and maybe the Guggenheim was about 12,000, and that, now it's much more. But that's what I had as a working budget for over a year, because when you take a sabbatical, you start in May and you don't come back till a year, September, further. But I will put in a plug for teaching, in the sense that I've been at Sarah Lawrence forever, and it's just the most wonderful place to teach, because you have very brilliant and very wacky students, and they're wonderful, and they become your friends. And amongst my good friends are people who were my students, some of whom names like Ellen, who just sent a question, who's a great artist, Ellen O'Hara Slavic, John Pilson, who teaches at Yale, Chris Wiley, who writes for the New Yorker, Alex Soth, who, and I could go on and on and on. So it's a debate whether you want to teach. There's, artists are always talking about, well, maybe you'd be better off doing something totally unrelated. And but that's where shucks, that's what I've gone and done. There's a Gary Snyder poem I'm quoting. Gary Snyder talks about hay for the horses. And he says, 50 years ago, I came to these high Sierras for the summer to shovel hay for the horses. And I vowed I'd never spend another year doing it. And shucks, that's what I've gone and done. And so that's what I can say about teaching.
And our final question today will be coming from Chloe.
Thank you, Joel and Geoffrey, for today's conversation, which has been such a pleasure to listen to. Before we went live today, Joel, you were talking about photographing a recent Trump rally. And I am curious how American prospects and the work you've done since has impacted how you photograph the American landscape now, if at all.
Yeah. Well, I haven't been working all that much. 16 years ago, I was lucky enough to get married to a wonderful woman, and we had a wonderful child. And the sort of travel that I did on American prospects just hasn't been feasible. I tend to be a very all or nothing sort of person, and when it was American prospects and stranger passing and on the site and Sweet Earth, that's all I did. And now I've been here and rooted ever since. But to the extent that I am working out there, I would say that I'm as confused as anyone. It's the most perplexing phenomenon to see what's happening. What I mentioned before we started is that at this Trump rally, people were polite, they were gentle, they weren't rabid at all, they weren't vicious. And I was there with my collections manager, Joel, and there was no prejudice expressed, and yet, the most horrible thing may be unfolding in this country, and I don't have an understanding of it. I can only liken it to, there are periods in American history when a sort of madness runs through the landscape and runs through the populace. There's a wonderful book by Kurt Anderson called Fantasyland, and he points out that in Salem, Massachusetts, Salem and the witch trials was not an isolated phenomenon. At that time in the United States, 90 some odd percent of people believed in witchery. Or in the 1820s and 30s and 40s in New York State, it was a period of great religiosity. Upstate New York was referred to as the burned over district. And why was it burned over? Because so many itinerant preachers had gone up there, setting up tents and preaching and getting all the money there was to go to religion. So it feels like we're going through a similar period of madness, and where and how it ends, I don't know. There's always been a pendulum that has swung and swung back. Whether it's going to swing back this time, I really don't know. And so it's hard to know how to depict. On the board behind me, there are pictures from our trip, and I know I'm running long, but there's pictures of a farm in Bucks County that has maybe about 100 signs along the roadside. So wealthy farm. And the woman who put them up came out and talked to me. Usually I ask permission, but the farmhouse or the farm was way back in the landscape. And I didn't think the signs were hers. They were so professionally done that I thought this must be an official Republican Party signage, and it was strictly hers. And she was very warm and gracious and well-spoken, and invited us back for water, whatever. And we were working and didn't do it. But she's clearly a woman of means and a woman of sensibility. She had 4 children in high school. She adopted animals that were injured. And there she was. And the signs are pure madness. The signs are just, just a detailed description of what will happen under communism, as if that were imminent. And so I don't understand, and I have no insight.
Thank you, Joel, for that answer. And just thank you again from all of us at the Rail for this conversation today.
Can I walk down the hall safely?
I'm gonna pass the mic back over to Min. Of course you can,
Thank
Joel.
you.
That's going to conclude the Q&A today. I want to pass it over to Joel, who's going to close us out with a reading.
Oh dear.
I'll
Well,
share.
when this came up, and you do understand that, I mean, that I have never done, well, I guess I sort of did in Vienna last year, but by and large, I have avoided the interview altogether. You won't find written interviews with me, but uh, I, I, if I wanted to keep living in this building happily, I had to. So uh, this poem by Robert Lowell came to mind, and you'll see why I chose it as I get to a certain line. So this is Epilogue by Robert Lowell, and he writes, "Those blessed structures, plot and rhyme, why are they no more help to me now? I want to make something imagined, not recalled. I hear the noise of my own voice. The painter's vision is not a lens. It trembles to caress the light. But sometimes everything I write with the threadbare art of my eye seems a snapshot, lurid, rapid, garish, grouped, heightened from life, yet paralyzed by fact, all's misalliance. Yet why not say what happened? Pray for the grace of accuracy. Vermeer gave to the sun's illumination, stealing like the tide across a map to his girl, solid with yearning. We are poor passing facts, warned by that to give each figure in the photograph his living name."
Thank you so much, Joel. And thank you, Joel and Geoffrey, for this wonderful conversation. Thank you also, Lily from Joel's Studio and the Bruce Museum for their support in preparing for today's event. We'd also like to thank the Terra Foundation for American Art for sponsoring our NSE program and making these daily conversations possible, and for their support of our growing archive, which you can view on the Rails YouTube channel. The Rail has been free and independent for 24 years. A donation directly supports our writers, production staff, and operations. You can support our work through the link in the chat. Join us tomorrow at 1 p.m. for a conversation with Jenny Kindler, Jessica Gath, Laura Lupton, Andrew Cashel, Deville Cohen, Robin Williams, and Julie Reese for a discussion of Artist Commit. You can now turn on your microphone and say goodbye as you leave. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Joel.
Thank you,
Thank you so much. Thank you, Jeffrey.
Thank
Great conversation, really. Thank you.
you in that elevator.
Wait a minute.
Hi, thank you.
Thank you.
Give me a hug.
Oh.
Bye.
Give me a hug. Give me a hug. Zuzu. Yeah, how was it? Was I good? Was I okay? Zuzu, give me a hug. Give me a hug. Oh,
Thank you, Joel and Jeff. Take care of you.
Thanks so much, Jeff. I hope I didn't get testy. It's a romantic versus a formalist. And,
Well, it's the first time I've been accused of that, Joel. I'll tell you that.
okay. Why did I have to drag in French critical theory? Why didn't you drag it in? What's wrong with you?
It's good if it comes from you.
Mention it at every opportunity.
Bye, everyone. Take care.
Bye. Thank you.
Be